So basically the question that I had, we just don't have enough of this, it's taken too long, was what kind of competitive conduct or what kind of conduct is prohibited? And, a couple more. So basically there are lots, in that broad spectrum of the Act, of the things that the competition parts of the Act do, there is still a large range of different kinds of prohibited conduct, ranging from things like cartel offences, we have offences plus civil prohibitions, misuse of power, misuse of market power and trans-Tasman market power, so we're working with New Zealand as well, below cost pricing, third line forcing, a range of different kinds of activities. In the consumer conduct space, misleading, deceptive conduct, unconscionable conduct, unfair contract terms, restricted of course to standard form contracts, certain unfair practices, and there are a whole heap of mandated positive requirements. So things that people need to do, providing guarantees, labelling, specific requirements if you're going to offer a 2-year warranty, for example, a warranty period, safety warning notices. So we've both got prohibitions on one side in the consumer space and mandated requirements on the other. So before we get too much further, again, this is another one where you need to go to the website. We will do this. I want you to think about what a per se prohibition is. Because in order to understand this legislative process, we really need to make sure that we're on the same page about the per se prohibitions.
Competitive or consumer related?
Question. Go with competitive to start off with if you think you need to have a, if you need to distinguish between the two. But really, if something is per se prohibited, whether it's a competition issue or a consumer issue, it's either per se prohibited or it's not. So I want to make sure you understand the difference between per se prohibition or just a general competition prohibition or consumer law prohibition. I want to show you how to use the blogging platform too before we finish up. So I'll move this along a little. Oh, somebody's up there. A per se prohibition is detrimental to competition whether intent is there or not. Per se prohibitions are acts that any instance of which is predetermined to be a breach of the Act or the ACL. Yeah. This will be my formatting, by the way. I will have done something wrong. Got another option? Got.
I'll just be repeating what's up there. By the time I log in and start typing.
You want to vote? You can be the one voter. What I would say about these two is the second of them is a definition of what a per se prohibition is. So per se means it's prohibited. It's not prohibited if in certain circumstances, like for example you have some kind of mens rea or something else. It's just you can't do it. The first is the reason why we have per se prohibitions. So the first is an explanation for this idea of, so basically a per se offence is an offence or a practice which Parliament has seen as so generally offensive to the goals that underlie the Act that they're to be condemned without consideration of the purpose or effect that that Act would have. So you just can't do it. So a really good example of that is misleading or deceptive conduct. Doesn't matter whether you intended to mislead or deceive. Doesn't matter whether you did it for a good reason. Doesn't matter that somebody had a gun to your head prohibited. Doesn't matter that the whole market was better off because you did it. You just can't do it. And that's opposed to, and I said competition before because I don't have consumer on the same one, but a general prohibition. So the competition space, they're things that aren't prohibited absolutely, but will be prohibited if on the evidence the activity or the maligned conduct has the purpose of substantially lessening competition, has the effect of substantially lessening competition, or is likely to have the effect of substantially lessening competition. So in other words, do not pass go, do not collect $200. If you're doing this for the wrong reasons, you need to stop and you've committed an offence.
In terms of the per se offence, does that mean if my conduct is misleading or deceptive, but the other person doesn't get misled or isn't deceived, you're still in breach?
It's a really good question. So the question is, if somebody's conduct is misleading or deceptive, but the other person isn't in fact misled or deceived, is it misleading or deceptive conduct in the first place? And we will talk about this a bit over the next couple of weeks anyway. But the short answer is, if it is misleading or deceptive conduct, it's prohibited. So then the question is it in fact misleading or deceptive? There would be quite a lot in your favour in an argument that your behaviour couldn't possibly have been misleading or deceptive if in fact people weren't misled or deceived. And the example that I always give there is Red Bull. You see those ads all the time, you know, gives you wings. I've drunk it, I felt a little bit sick from all the sugar in the caffeine, but I didn't have any wings. I did, and I wasn't disappointed because I wasn't expecting them. Now, that's a puff. Oh, was there a class action? Oh, really? I really do need to find it.
Only in America.
Only in America.
There's 7, I think, the value of or 2 Red Bull cans per
Yes.
So it doesn't give me wings, but I want to have a can of Red Bull anyway.
So here's
now I'm going to get 2 cans of Red Bull.
The value of or actual 2 cans per?
Yes. I will check that out before I'm... So, but you'll remember that, going right back to basics of smoke ball, Carlo and carbolic smoke ball. Is it a puff or is it actually misleading or deceptive? So that would go to evidence, number 1. Number 2, remember, particularly in Section 18, misleading or deceptive conduct, it is an offence, but of itself, it doesn't give a right to damages. So there still needs to be a connection between the behaviour and the end result. So
if you weren't deceived, there's no point in you bringing the action.
Yeah. But the ACCC, on the other hand, might come out and say, or might want to stop that behaviour because, sure, I'm not deceived by your behaviour because I'm a sophisticated and professional investor, and I've gone into investor speak now, but ASIC has very similar provisions here, but they may want to prevent that behaviour because there's this chance of somebody being misled or deceived. So even with these, question, is there a substantial chance or a chance that that kind of behaviour will ultimately result in a substantial lessening of competition in the market? So again, what we're looking at here is we're not protecting competitors, we're protecting competition, the field of endeavour, the field of play. So the per se offences, so the things that we don't care why or what the impact is, are things like cartel offences, exclusionary provisions, third line forcing, resale price maintenance. So these are things that are just prohibited. And then what we'll do is move on, because in relation to some of those, you can get an authorisation. So in other words, something from the ACCC saying, we're going to waive your requirement to comply with the Act in this particular circumstance. But on the face of it, it's a per se prohibition. And then the competition prohibitions, which are the interesting thing that a lot of this case law is around, are arrangements between competitors. So vertical arrangements of some sort. So where, well, other than price fixing, so things like joint ventures, collaborations, franchising, exclusive dealings and distribution arrangements. Franchising actually does fit into that bullet point, or mergers or other forms of transactions in some way. So in other words, you can buy whatever of your competitors or your suppliers or your customers that you want to, unless on the evidence, the reason that you're buying is to substantially lessen competition. The effect of you buying is to substantially lessen competition, or it's likely to have that effect. So, what I have here on these slides are the facts and the analysis for rural press. There are a lot of cases, and I am purposefully not going through them one by one, because I want to talk about the overview and let you guys get your head around the cases. But I thought that I'd just do a quick analysis of rural press, because it's important for our understanding of markets later on anyway, and just point out to you what you need to be looking at in these competition cases. So I know most of the academics will say, you know, using things like MIRAT or ISAC or any of those, what do we call them, acronyms, to remember how to go through cases is not the best way to do it, and I think that's probably right if you're writing a PhD or research in depth, but from the point of view of actually understanding what it is you're looking for, if you can, and for problem solving too, if you can look at what the material facts are, if you can identify what the issues are, if you can recite the law, apply the issues to it and come up with some sort of conclusion or tentative conclusion, you're on the right track. So rural press, which is one of the key cases in this area, is a case about two warring newspaper businesses. They were out, I think, I'm sorry, I've got MIRAT, here's what I mean. So basically, here's a little extract from Google Maps. So you can see where they are. So the Murray Bridge, the Murray Valley Standard, I should say, which was published by Rural Press, it's basically in sort of roughly this area, Murray Bridge and Madam. That's where it sold its copies. Actually, I don't know whether they sold, it might have even been a free local newspaper, but it certainly made its money from advertising from businesses in this scope. Roughly an hour and 52 minutes drive away, there was River Press, which is Waikerie Printing, and its distribution area was part of this, also this Murray Valley and the north part of South Australia, and possibly, I don't think it went out, I haven't drawn it this far, I think actually it might have even pushed over as far as Renmark, so going towards Victoria or the south of New South Wales, I guess. But then they would also sell a few copies down here around in Madam. We'll get a bit of advertising around there. So Murray Valley said, yeah, if you keep selling here, then we're going to sell up in your area. So the question was, and essentially nothing had happened yet. The ACCC said, well, you're making a threat, and that threat could have the result of substantially lessening competition. So what's the issue? Did the two papers come to an arrangement or an understanding that they would both play in their respective areas? If they had actually zoned their markets, was the market itself, or was that arrangement an exclusionary arrangement of some sort? The High Court on Ultimate Appeal also looked at whether all of the elements of an offence had been committed, had to identify what the relevant market is. So just going back to my map there for a minute, So we've got market, we can see from the point of view of they're zoned in particular areas, but what do you think, what other aspects or elements might a market have in this situation? What features would the
The type
market...
of the newspaper.
Sorry, there's something...
The type of the paper they were at.
The type of, yeah, so, well, they're both selling local papers. So, okay, so this is, so it's a markets in these two areas. We can see that they're pretty geographically distinct from each other for local papers. And the customers are readers of papers, advertisers in the paper. But even though they're geographically quite dispersed, you can see there are not a lot of towns on that highway. So my guess is, even though it's 2 hours drive away, if you wanted to buy a tractor, you're just as likely to look at tractor sellers in this area as you are to look at tractor sellers in this area. Or if you want to buy a real estate advertising. Farms, I'm assuming they're pretty big, where these are quite big areas. If we actually moved into Adelaide here and looked at local papers there, they might actually overlap or be in much, much smaller areas because you've got a much bigger population. Other issues, did rural press take advantage of its market power in the Murray Bridge newspaper market? So was it taking advantage of the power that it had? And does the use of financial and other resources constitute market power or the use of market power? And what powers did the court have in regard to remedies? So this simple little case about two local newspapers jostling for position. I think I didn't mention earlier that rural press is part of a much larger group. It had significantly deeper pockets. So its threat was enough to send white reprinting hiding. So you can see a lot of quite significant issues if you take them outside of what we're talking about here with these small newspapers into a broader thing. So the sections that they were looking at, two of them. So section 45, which provides for restrictive dealings, so contracts that prohibit contracts that have an anti-competitive effect. So is this a section 45 contract? Is this arrangement a contract of itself? And section 46, was rural press misusing its market power, if it had market power at all? So the court found that there was an arrangement or an understanding, that the provision of zoning would limit the ability of a person in the area to have access to a second newspaper. But that was the effect of the arrangement rather than the purpose of it. So, as I mentioned earlier, this effect-purpose debate we've been going on with for some time. What should that be? So, at the time, the prohibition was against entering into arrangements for the purpose of substantially reducing competition in the market. So, the evidence didn't support all of the elements of the provisions. So, there was no particular class identified. Now, it's worth looking at. You will find this if you pull out the judgments to look at these. Competition cases in particular are really long. They go on and on and on forever. They often have massive hearings. So it's not at all unusual to have hearings that go for 100 days. And they'll basically be pitting one economic expert against another. Because these ultimately become cases about each element of the provisions, and particularly when talking about big dollars, people are prepared to fund these cases. So it's very good for the lawyers, let me tell you, you don't want to knock it too hard. Ultimately, it also found that at the time that the arrangements were entered into, neither of them really had any market power in the relevant area, because they were fighting about that zone in the middle. And that the financial and other resources that rural press had didn't constitute market power or the use of market power. It's not a bad thing to use the resources that you have in that particular case. Kirby, not surprisingly, didn't agree particularly on the not a bad thing to use the resources that you have. And ultimately, subsequent cases have probably erred more towards Kirby's views. But the point of actually going through that is to say, don't be overwhelmed by these cases. Pull them apart. The textbook is really good. And read the textbook, get your head around the purpose of the case, and then when you need to, drill into the particular provisions. Other cases set for this week and the coming weeks include rural press, Qantas and universal music. And we can talk about all of them at some point. But I'd like you to read them with these things in mind. So when you get to the point of looking at these cases, you need to see that these are complex cases and they often turn on individual facts. These cases show the use of these tests in the wild. Looking at the with and without test, the structure, what is it called? The SCP paradigm test that we talked about last week. Structure, conduct, performance. What's the structure of the market? What's the conduct of the performers in the market? What is the ultimate performance of the parties? How do these things fit together? Competitiveness of players in the market isn't the same thing as competitiveness of the market. These cases, whilst they involve competitors fighting often against each other, the purpose of the legislation is to protect the competitiveness of the market, not to protect the competitiveness of a competitor, not to protect some competitive advantage that they may or may not have had that might be eroded by some newcomer. The other thing to think about this, about market power as well, is the extent to which large market share is the same thing as market power. So, and the best example I can give for that is, again, going back to Apple. We always suffer with Apple a little bit because they've made such massive changes. Before the iPhone came in to Australia, before that first iPhone was available, there was a market for smartphones, sort of, and iPods or whatever. But we all knew that that market was going to radically change on day one. And we knew it could radically change by the intervention of one player. But simultaneously, or actually not simultaneously, because they'd introduced the iTunes market for music by that time, 18 months or 2 years or so before it was actually attached to the phone part as well, they were introducing and creating new markets. If the market doesn't exist, you can't have power in it, even if it's inevitable that you will have power in it. Similarly, having a large share that can survive an attempt to charge high prices and ultimately achieve a monopoly profit will mean that you do have a market. So large share, if you can control price, you have market power. You have a large share that you can't actually control price, maybe you don't. So good example maybe of the first, it's easier to see the ones that have, is commodity sellers. So although there's a lot of discussion, so Trinity Forest will be telling you at the moment that BHP and Rio Tinto are misusing their market power because they're slowing down, or they're increasing production when they need to slow it down while the prices are low and they're pushing prices of iron ore down. Bless you. Are they controlling prices? Well, the HLC says at the moment, well, no, they don't think they are controlling prices. That they can withstand low prices for a period of time.